Okay. So I want to look at the development this week. Just to put this into context, where the contingency plans fit from my perspective, the top level of the organization, you'll have a crisis management plan. The contingency plan is scenario specific or situation specific. That's going to sit in the middle. And then underneath that, you're going to have a series of processes and procedures or SOPs that you can then use to execute the plan. So the CMP is the top level document. That should be situation neutral. That's really just going to give you the OS operating system for your response. What we're talking about today is contingency plans. So they're for a specific situation, mapping out the how the scenario could develop, looking at the course of action you could follow, and then you'll have the CMP will give you direction, and the tools and SOPs that you have are actually the things that you will use to go through and execute on the contingency plan. And then these processes and procedures, I look at those like a golf bag or a toolkit. You can go and grab the one that you need. So if you need to do mass notification, you have a process for that. If you need to do a product recall, you have a process for that. Telework, shelter in place, business continuity plans, or the components of a business continuity plan. Those are all the tools that you have. And so right now, a lot of people are already working at how to do remote telework, how to maintain customer service when they can't be in the physical workplace, etc. So a lot of those will fall into that SOPs and tools element. So we brushed over this last week, and this is what I really want to get into in a little bit more detail. And there's a few things I want to stress on this. Contingency plan development isn't necessarily particularly complicated. The plan itself can be fairly straightforward. The hard thing often is to try to work out how things could develop, and therefore the specific scenarios you could be dealing with. In most of this, the challenge is going to be on the execution side. So when it actually comes to executing the plan, that's where things really start to get difficult. Because even though we have a plan in place to begin with, it can only give us the top level direction. And then when the situation hits and we start to execute on that plan, there's still going to have to be adjustments made along the way. Clearly, there's no way we can plan right now, today, or there was no way we could have planned a couple of months ago exactly how coronavirus was going to develop. We could have had a pandemic plan. We could have had elements in place for shelter in place, work from home, etc. But we were always going to have to adjust those as the spread of the virus became clear, as how it manifested itself, where it hit hardest. We were always going to have to make some adjustments. So the point is, you're putting a plan in place, but that plan will have to be adjusted once you start on the execution side of things. So we're looking for, first of all, we want to have the best understanding possible we can of what the challenge is and how it might develop. I'll talk about that in a minute. We should always have an idea what our end state and objectives are, and those could change during the event itself. So depending upon how things develop, say at the national level, you may have to adjust your expectations of what you're trying to do. But you're going to have that at the end. That's like your North Star that you're going to be following along, and that really goes back to your company's, your organization's mission, your values, etc. When we have the situation, so we can use coronavirus, or we could use, I was working on something this morning and I used typhoons as an example. That's the situation, but we then need to understand what the scenarios could be. How could that develop? So we're going to map out the scenarios, and I'll talk about that in a second, and then what courses of action we would take. So if we see this scenario, say the worst case scenario, what options do we have then? What courses of actions do we have? And we need to have those laid out, because those essentially are the core of the plan that you're going to execute on at the end, or when the thing occurs, sorry. And some of these other things we'll get into in a moment. I don't want to go through this whole list, but essentially what we're trying to put together is the plan that when we see the situation develop, we pull out that plan and we start to look at how do we think it could develop, what scenario path do we think we're on, if we're on that scenario path, what decision points do we have, and what course of action does that lead us to. And when we get to that course of action, we've mapped that out as well. I'll talk about how we do that. You already have the core of your actual response built out, And then, as I said, you need to adapt that for the specifics of the exact specifics of the situation, but you've got the core elements of your plan built already. So that's what I'm talking about in as far as contingency planning is concerned. So I'm going to jump into the details a little bit now. So the situation and scenario mapping. Whatever the situation is, I like to start with, let's describe the situation we could be facing. So in this case, it's a global pandemic, could be a storm season, something like that. And then we start asking, so what? So the point is to start asking, what does that mean? How could that develop? What does that mean for us? How is that going to affect our business? And so you see, I've put a couple of examples there, and you just keep asking, so what? So what you're trying to do is get down to the point to say, the answer to the so what is, therefore I have to do X, I have to do Y, we should plan for Z. And what that allows you to do is then say, okay, what do we need to have reflected in our contingency plan, in those courses of action? Asking so what over and over and over will actually help you drill down. So in this case, disrupting factories in coastal regions, so what? It's going to interrupt manufacturing, so what? Delay fulfillment, and on you go. And once you've sort of run that one down and you feel that you've really got into the detail there and you've got a couple of specific actions, jump back up to the high level. Okay, so we'll also prevent staff from coming to work, so what? And then you start to drill back down. And you can keep doing this and start to get a sense of what the impacts would be. And then what you can do is you can then take that and then look at the different scenarios. But the first point is to keep asking, so what, and break it down. If you have a plan that just says there could be hurricanes, that doesn't really mean anything because we don't know what the impact would be. Global pandemic, we don't know what the impact could be. We don't know what we're planning for. So you have to ask, so what? And you have to ask that in the context of, so what does that mean for us? So what does that mean for organizations? So what does that mean for operations? How might that affect our overall objective? So that's why you're asking, so what? Because this is highly subjective. So everyone is going to be affected by this situation very differently. And I think I've used the example previously of civil unrest. Most organizations in a time of tension, that is a negative risk. It is going to impact them negatively. But if you're a security company, it's an opportunity. So that's an extreme example, but the point is it's quite subjective, and the same situation will affect every organization and group quite differently. So by asking, so what, each time, that's helping you drill down and understand. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean for our business? What does this mean for our people? So once we've done that, we're going to be able to break the situation down and get a few different scenarios. And we want these scenarios to be quite diverse. We don't want three scenarios that basically are all kind of the same. I've just used the words likely, worst case, and best case scenario here. You may use different terms for it. It might not necessarily be the best and worst case. You might just have three very different options that come up, and you want to figure out how to tackle them. The point of having the different pathways is that if you have 2 or 3 paths that all generally look the same, you probably haven't looked at the extremes. Now, we hope we're not going to have to operate in the extremes, but by looking at the extremes, we've prepared ourselves. Remember, this is contingency planning. We are preparing for the worst, so there's no point doing contingency planning and assuming that everything will be basically okay. Everything will be basically the same. So what we're going to end up having is 3 different pathways, 3 different scenarios. So, and again, an example using typhoons or hurricanes, let's say the likely case is that there is landfall. It's not going to hit our operations directly, so there's some secondary damage, and we're going to work through that. The worst case scenario is a direct hit and enormous damage. And the best case scenario is essentially it burns out somewhere in offshore, and we have a lot of wind and storm surge and rain, but we don't really have a hurricane or typhoon hitting. So that gives you these 3 very different options to consider. And what actually happens will be somewhere in between those 3. So it's somewhere between essentially nothing and a direct hit. But by having these 3 scenarios mapped out, as I said, you're going to adjust when things actually happen. That's going to give you those courses of action that you can then start to use for your planning. So while you're doing this, the other thing is look for and identify the triggers. So what conditions indicate that you're on that path? So again, to go back to storms, it would be, we're now in storm season. We know that storm season happens at certain times of the year, and therefore we can expect those storms. As far as coronavirus, the trigger was widespread transmission, or transmission outside of China, or whatever metrics we have about seeing those as triggers, then that's going to push us down a particular path. Sometimes the triggers might be things that are forced upon us. So in a lot of places in the US and other countries, the government is mandating what we need to do. So it's less of a trigger for us to have to identify the trigger and then react. But if we can see the government starting to talk about some kind of restrictions, or it could be for lifting restrictions, once we hear that sort of chatter, that indicates that we're getting towards that trigger, and the trigger would be the final announcement. So we're trying to map those out. So when we see those triggers, we can start to see, okay, we're now moving down that particular path. What should we be doing? And then the last part of the planning, or one of the most detailed parts of the planning, once we have those scenarios, is have a course of action. Now, there should be a separate course of action for each scenario. You may actually have more, even if you have 3 scenarios, you might have 4 or 5 courses of action, because you could have alternate courses of action that you could use depending upon the situation. So you will end up with these courses of action, and essentially what that's trying to do is that, as I said, is the bare bones of your actual plan, the plan that you're going to execute depending upon the situation. And these are the key things you want to have in that course of action. So responsibility is who is responsible for that. So of course, depending upon what you're doing, it may be a different member of your leadership team, a different manager. So you've got to specify who is responsible for that, because they're responsible for the detailed planning of that. And then they're also responsible for executing that plan. So you've got to be clear who is responsible for that course of action. Overview, just give a sort of general outline of what the course of action is. It doesn't need to be very long, but just enough so that someone reading it will understand generally what that course of action entails. So it could be shelter in place and move to telework. It could be evacuate people from the affected area. Just a short summary of what that course of action is. When we get to decision points, I'm going to come to those in a moment, but the decision point is essentially at what stage do you need to decide to take that action, to trigger that course of action. And that's quite a complicated, it's not a complicated thing, but it needs a little bit of thought. So I'm going to come back to those in a moment. But you have to specify the decision point for that course of action, clarify the objective, and then have the critical actions. And these 2 things are key, because that objective and those critical action, there's a huge cascade comes out of that, because other people are going to take those actions and be responsible for those. So you have a sort of knock-on effect for the planning cycle. So it's important to stress those in there. And it also helps you look at the plan and say, okay, our objective is to move all of our people to safety. What critical actions do we have to complete to achieve that? So when you're reviewing the plan, you have to then work from the bottom up and say, if we complete these actions, will we have achieved our objective? And that's a good way to stress test the plan before you get into the detail. And again, as a reminder, the course of action is pretty high level. It's not super detailed. So you're going to take that and build a plan from that later on. So you get the objective and critical action. And then with the requirements, it's staffing, it's resources, it could be authority, it could be money. Whatever the key things are, you need to make that work. So if you're going to go to telework, do you have the infrastructure set up so people can telework? Most people have a laptop or something they can use, or a smartphone or a tablet, but have you built the infrastructure in your organization for them to access their details? Without that, it's not going to work. Have you provided authority to the right levels of the organization to make this thing work? If you want to evacuate, how are you going to do that? Do you have an ability to get the resources that you need? So you don't have to specify all of them, but you just have to identify these in the course of action. So essentially, the course of action is a summary of your plan. Who's responsible for it? A general description of what it is. The decision point, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Objective and critical actions, that's key. That's how you're going to measure success. Did we achieve our objective? And what are those stepping stones to get to those? What are the stepping stones to get to that? Which are the critical actions? And then what are the key requirements that you need? And the idea is that you would then be able to say to someone, take this course of action, take this summary, and go and build that into a plan. And you can do some of that in advance, or as the situation starts to develop, you might say, okay, now we need to get into the detail and start planning out for each of these courses of action in more detail. Okay, so course of action, we've talked about a bit, but essentially, if X happens, we do Y. So if we see this particular scenario, this is what we're going to do. So there's a pathway between those. The triggers, we're seeing that situation develop. We're going to take that course of action. But the decision point is when we need to make a decision. So if we want to shelter in place and there is a storm coming, our decision point can be relatively close. It could be, six hours or so beforehand, enough time to get people back home, barricade themselves up, to get some basic supplies. If your decision point is to evacuate from an area, you may need to make that decision 24 or 36 hours out, because as you start to get within that 24-hour window, you may not be able to evacuate. If you wanted to switch everyone to telework, you may have had to make that decision 24 hours before it actually happened to give people the chance to get into work, to put the files they have on their desktop into a shared drive, to make sure they've got the right access codes or whatever it is they need to actually telework. You may have had to make that decision 24 hours in advance. If people simply woke up one morning and were told, hey, we're teleworking today, that decision was maybe too late because they're not able to execute it. So the point is, when do we need to make a decision in order to make that course of action successful? And so that will depend upon what the course of action is and how complicated it is, and also how fast the situation is moving. So the decision points are, they're not particularly complicated, but they are very important to map those out, because I said not every decision point is going to fall at the same time. Sometimes you will pass through a decision point and may not even know, and therefore you'll be forced down a particular path. And what I would say is that there is a video I'm going to link to in the notes that I put online. I made it this morning. And it puts all of this into context. So starting with the situation, the triggers, building the scenarios, from the scenarios to the courses of action. So I'll put that in the notes and I'll share that with everyone in a second. You can watch that, and that will knit it all together. The reason I don't do it on the board right now, it takes me 30 minutes to put together a 5-minute video, and my writing's pretty bad, so I have to go back at it several times. But I'll put that in the notes, and then when you look at that, you'll see how all these things tie together. So what I'm going to do is just go back up here for a second and just review what's going to be in the plan. So we're going to start with an understanding of the situation. And one of the challenges I've got right now, and I just came off a call with some friends of mine who also work in the same sort of industry and consultancy. The challenge is right now, everyone wants a specific answer to their situation, and we can't do that with a 5-minute phone call. We can't give a plan to everyone that will work for everyone, because everyone's facing different challenges right now. Looking at the stats in the US, Amazon has an increase in demand. So Amazon is facing a very different situation than local restaurants, which have had to shut down. New York is very different to Houston right now. So everything is very unique and very individual. So all I'm trying to do here is give you the framework so you can take this framework, analyze the situation, and then apply it to your own organization. And unfortunately, a lot of that relies upon the subject matter expertise that you have for your organization, or that I would only get as a consultant after having spent some time getting to know you. So that's why I can't just pull out the sort of one SOP to rule them all, one contingency plan that will work for everyone. So start with the best understanding possible, and then map out how that might develop. And that's where we're going to have these development paths and the scenarios. And then each of those will lead us down a course of action. Now, what I would say is coronavirus is here. It's very much here. It's in most countries in the world, if not, it's not in every country in the world. It seems that sub-Saharan Africa right now and some of Latin America has not been hit as hard, but it's likely that it will arrive in almost every country before too long. It doesn't mean that we can't contingency plan, because we're still early on, relatively speaking, in what is going to be a months-long event. And we're now having to plan for the immediate effects on us, So I see that somebody here is in the Northeast US. They're probably on lockdown right now and having to do some kind of telework or remote work. We're on lockdown here. I live in Amman, Jordan right now. We're on lockdown. This is our 3rd week when basically we can't leave the house. But for businesses and organizations, we're going to then have to start contingency planning on what do the next 3 or 4 months look like. So how are we going to manage our organizations and our business over the next 3 or 4 months while we have these interruptions in place? And then what do we do when we go back to normal, or whatever the new normal is, in say 6 or 9 months, when maybe we have a vaccine, maybe we have a way to test people more effectively and quickly, and therefore we have mass movement again, but it's going to be different. So we're contingency planning for what that looks like, because there could be new regulations in place. There could be new travel restrictions in place. There might just not be as much travel. I spoke to someone yesterday who's in the travel industry. They're projecting in some locations down to 20% of flights will go back on, because the airlines don't see the point in going all the way back up to full capacity, because they don't expect people to travel. So how does that affect your business, your organization? So we can still be contingency planning, even though it might feel like we're already in the event and we're just reacting. We're not. We can still contingency plan for how this plays out. So we're going to map out the scenarios, have the course of action. Those are essentially the core of our plans that we're going to have, outlining the responsibilities, the decision points. The objective and critical actions are really, really important, because without those, the person planning won't really be able to make sure that they've achieved the objective with their plan, and then the requirements that are needed, and also limitations, because you may want to put limitations in there. Once you put all that together, then you have your contingency plan. And when you see those triggers on the horizon, when you see the event unfolding, pull it off the shelf, start tracking where you're going, flesh out those courses of action into detailed plans, and then when the time comes, you're gonna execute.